Welcome to this lecture on constitutional compromise in United States history. We are going to be looking at target 2.03 in this lecture as we examine how Americans decided in the late 1780s that they would create a new form of government for themselves. The compromises that they came up with enabled that government to take flight, but it also created problems for the future. Let's examine them. Oftentimes, we look at the guys who wrote our current Constitution as almost demigods, highly educated, elite men, well-read, brilliant thinkers. But we forget that as men of their age, they were racist and sexist, and their vision for the United States was really limited by the time period that they lived in. If you ever get a chance to go to Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, and then go over to the Constitution Center, you would have the opportunity to see the world that these guys operated in. And in particular, I really like the statuary in the Constitution Center that shows these men. You get to see them as they were. Their height, their weight, their faces as they stood at the time. And it reminds you that they are people just like you and I, and perhaps not the demigods that we have made them out to be. And so I think it's a very sobering look and a reminder that the world that they inhabited is a different world than ours. They worked under different assumptions, but they are by no means these figures that are beyond us, these immortal, transcendent men. They are just people. And while you're there looking at the place where they wrote the Constitution, you will notice just how small and cramped it was. I have to admire a little bit of their patience and their fortitude, though they got quite angry at each other and almost quit several times in the early stages of writing the Constitution. It's a small area to work in. They did their work in summer, and then they closed the windows so that people could not listen to their deliberations. It could be done in secret. And if you've ever been to Philadelphia in the summer, it is miserably humid. It is just downright swampy. So this could not have been an easy undertaking for these guys, as they were trying to listen to all the different voices in the room, figure out what would work for everyone, and make some very, very important decisions that shape how our government functions today. Some of those things we continue to praise. Other decisions that they made continue to give us trouble. The most important decision that they encountered first was how to represent the people of America and the states of America in this new national government that they were creating. So their first compromise is called the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. It's a balancing act between small states and large states. The fear of small states is that because they are smaller in population, they'll always get outvoted, because the large states will have more people and more of a voice in the government. Large states, on the other hand, like that idea because it means more people should have their voices heard. If a state has 100,000 folks, surely it should get a bigger voice than a state with 20,000, because 100,000 people outweigh 20,000. So to figure out how to resolve the conflict between the needs of the small and the large, they create two parts of our current government. One part is what the small states want, and that is the Senate of the United States. The Senate creates equal power. Every state in the United States gets 2 senators, regardless of how many people it serves. And this equality in the Senate makes all the states feel like they have the same amount of voice in making laws. So these small states are not going to get overrun in the US Senate. The large states wanted to make the government's representation based on population, because they felt like if you had more people, you should get more votes, you should get more representatives. And this is achieved in the House of Representatives, where the number of people in that house is determined based on how many people are in a particular state. A state with more people should get more votes, more voices. To show this, how this all came together, we can look at the 2 original plans offered for how to create representation in the US government. The Virginia plan proposed a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judiciary. In the legislative branch, it would be based on population, which is what large states wanted. Virginia was a large state, and so it made sense to Virginia that more people equals more votes. New Jersey, being a smaller state, had a different idea for the government. They wanted a single branch legislature, and that single branch legislature would have an executive committee with representation for all states equally. So combining the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan gives us our current system of government. Hence, it's the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, sometimes called. One of the compromises that would set up trouble for the future, and even today, causes us to rethink about our founding principles and founding values, is a compromise involving enslaved people. This compromise originated with Southern states who felt like they had a lot of enslaved people, and that should give them more of a voice in government. More property should be more power. Northern states said, oh, you want to count your property, and therefore power should go to you based on your property? Well, we should be able to count our cows then. And that set up a debate between the two sides. Southerners saying, if we don't get what we want, we're going to leave this Constitution and we'll be done with all of you. Northerners saying, well, it's not fair for you to count enslaved people to get more political power in the government. And the compromise eventually was 3/5. 3 out of every 5 enslaved persons would be counted in the population of the South, so it would have more representatives. The Southerners would have preferred to count all of the enslaved, but they settled for counting 3 out of every 5 of them. So the South would have a bigger population and therefore more votes in the new government. If you want to look at exactly how many more votes it gave them, in 1793, when they did all the math, it was revealed that the South would get 14 extra representatives in Congress based on this 3/5 compromise. So that's 14 extra people, 14 extra votes that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So all that's going to happen is from now on, 3 out of every 5 enslaved folks will get counted. So the South will have a bigger population. Now, here's where some confusion starts, because people get this mixed up all the time. The 3/5 compromise will not give enslaved people the right to vote. You are counting enslaved people for population purposes. You are not giving them voting privileges in this compromise. It doesn't make an enslaved person 3/5 of a human. They're a human to begin with. They're just a human that Southerners are treating as property and counting for the purposes of increasing their population. So keep in mind, this 3/5 compromise is about the number of representatives you get in Congress. It's not about seeing enslaved people as humans or 3/5 of a human. It's not really on Southerners' minds to do that. And it's not about giving them a right to vote either. A second compromise involving enslaved people, the slave trade compromise, resulted in permission for Southerners to continue to buy slaves from Africa for another 20 years. Southerners were afraid that Northerners would demand an end to the slave trade. And since they lost many of their enslaved folks at the end of the American Revolution, they wanted a chance to buy new people to replace those that had run away or died or escaped with the British. So for 20 more years, Southerners would be allowed to buy people from Africa to increase their enslaved populations. This compromise did in fact last until 1808, and that year, finally, the slave trade with Africa would be ended. So keep in mind, this is about securing enough replacement workers for those that were lost in the American Revolution in exchange for the potential for ending that trade after 20 years is over. Another compromise involved commerce, or the buying and selling or trading of goods. That's all commerce really means, to buy, sell, and trade. Think for MERS, that part right there, think merchant. This compromise was a debate over buying and selling goods with other countries. And the result was the federal government that would be created by this new constitution would be able to tax imports, things coming in from other countries, but not exports. This compromise was wanted by Southerners. They sold a lot of their produce outside of America to other countries, and they were afraid of that produce being taxed. So they wanted to protect their produce from being taxed as it was sold to other countries. The federal government could still, however, regulate trade if it crossed a state line. And so commerce has sort of two different areas where it can focus on in the Constitution. The United States government controls trade with other countries, but it also controls trade between states. which in some ways kind of implies that states are like little mini countries, and the federal government deals with relations between them. So we call that interstate commerce. Now, what about trade inside a state? Well, that is entirely within the state's control. So keep in mind, these commerce compromises, these debates over commerce are about trade with other countries as well as trade between states. So anything coming into America, these pink arrows here, can be taxed. Anything between states can be regulated by the federal government, but anything leaving cannot be taxed. The last compromise that we're going to talk about is the Electoral College compromise, which is being very much hotly debated over the last 20 years. This was a compromise over how Americans would elect their president. If you're going to have a president, which they didn't have before in the Articles of Confederation because it seemed too much like a king, how are you going to pick this person? Do you want him directly elected by all the people? Do you want him elected by the states? Do you want some kind of hybrid system? How are they going to do that? So Americans are going to, under the system, vote for electors. And the voting for these electors will then, in turn, allow the electors to choose the president. This will limit democracy, and it will put a layer of sort of insulation between the people and the president so that the people cannot elect a completely, absolutely, stupidly inappropriate person for president. And because of this limit on democracy, it would make the president less responsible or less responsive to ordinary Americans. Now, you might be asking, how do we get electors? Well, that process has changed over time. Originally, the states often chose the electors, so the state Congress would get together and say, we're going to pick Bob and Jeff and Fred, and they're going to be the electors. Some states allowed the people to vote for electors, and electors would say, I'm campaigning as an elector for George Washington. And so throughout time, how the electors get chosen has not always been the same. Today, you and I vote, well, not you, because you're not old enough to vote yet. We vote as a country for the candidates, and then generally, whichever candidate gets a majority of the votes gets the electors for that state. And the electors are chosen by the political parties' leadership in that state. So that's the system as it exists today. It is not a system that many Americans like anymore because they feel like this filtering of the will of the people through these rich elite electors limits the voice of Americans in their choice of president. And there are a lot of Americans who today believe we should choose the president completely based on the popular vote and allow the people to choose. So this presentation has been all the compromises that we want to address in this class. Keep in mind, we are still dealing with the consequences of these compromises. They're quite important for the government that they create.